Hi, my name is Ross Thompson. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of California, Davis. And I'm so glad you're involved in this NCSL Early Childhood Fellows Program because of the great benefits you can bring to young children and their families in the state where you work and also throughout the country. I've been asked to say a few words about why early childhood matters. And it's a topic that really lays the foundation for some of what you'll be learning and doing as part of the fellowship program. And so let me, without further ado, turn to the inevitable PowerPoint. I probably won't be telling you anything new when I remind you that a lot of the reason we have such an appreciation of the importance of early experience is because of the astonishing research on early brain development. And what we have learned from that research has been that the early childhood months and years are a period of astonishing growth in the pace and the significance of neural connections and of brain developing capacity over this period of time. In many respects, the brain is developing at a more rapid pace in the early months and years of life than it ever will at any subsequent period of development. But what the brain development research has really done is to help confirm and extend what we've already known from literally thousands of studies of the development of young children's thinking, reasoning, learning, problem-solving skills, the development of their social awareness, their emotional perception, their self-regulation, and in many other capacities we have seen in those studies the ways in which the early years lay a foundation for the developing capacities that will follow from those. To illustrate that, let me just show you four important brain behavior advances. And I use these to illustrate because these are areas in which it is not only well documented the important advances that take place in children's behavior in these areas, but also the documented neural connections that are taking place in the brain areas that subserve those behavioral capacities. Consider the most foundational of all, the development of sensory capacities, seeing and hearing that, for example, enable children to be able to keep in touch and to be able to transact with the world in which they live. These begin prenatally, and they also continue to extend in development throughout the early months and the first couple of years of life. Or consider language, such an important foundational capacity, not only for communication, but also for thinking and reasoning. That too begins prenatally as the fetus is able to hear vocal sounds from the intrauterine environment, but also extends through the early adolescent years. If we consider higher cognitive functions, which we typically think is developing in adolescence, yes, they do, but they also begin emerging well into the early childhood years. In fact, some foundations are laid in place prenatally. And then if we also look at perhaps one of the most important developing advances, namely the capacity for self-regulation, one that continues to develop in the early adult years, but again, has its foundations in some of the advances in the brain and also children's behavioral capacities in the very early months and years of life. And if you look at these, you can see pretty readily why the first 2 years are the focus of so much attention by developmental researchers. And even beyond the first 2 years, why the first 5 years are of such developmental significance. In many respects, these accomplishments lay the foundation for much of what follows later. And that foundation may be a strong and secure one, but it also may be relatively weak and compromised, especially if children are growing up in unstimulating and adverse environments in the early years. And one of the ways that researchers have begun to think about the importance of early childhood is in terms of what we call actually a snowball effect. The technical term for this is called developmental cascades, but I think the snowball effect is actually a little bit easier to wrap our minds around. And it really describes the ways in which early experiences and influences are now believed to create a set of corollary influences lead to the development of characteristics and competencies that influence other developing processes that together over time begin to create a progressive momentum toward either positive or negative developmental outcomes. So that as children are growing up from the infancy period to early childhood and eventually to young adulthood, they are carrying with them the legacy of the developmental influences that have had their genesis prenatally, many of them, but many of them also in the early months of life, and have simply created a progressive momentum that is helping to move development along a particular trajectory. These trajectories can, as I mentioned earlier, be constructive and positive, and lead children toward successful adult accomplishments, or they can be more negative, depending upon, in many respects, the kinds of early experiences and influences that children have had. I want to emphasize this is not a deterministic model. We all know that things can happen, that can intervene, that can significantly alter an adult's life course. But we also know that as children continue to progress developmentally, there is this sense of a forward moving that is built upon early experiences and influences. And this is one of the reasons why we think those early years are so important. So how do we support early childhood development? And I think in general, we can think of at least two broad strategies. One is to promote healthy development, to provide children with the experiences and the opportunities that are going to really take advantage of the incredibly strong pace of early brain development, but also help to create a positive momentum that will help lead children toward more progressive accomplishments as they move out of early childhood and into the grade school and adolescent years. But for many children, one of the other ways in which we support early child development is in terms of removing obstacles, recognizing that these children are sometimes born into circumstances or encounter experiences that promote more adversity, that create greater difficulties to their developing success. And some of what we can best do for these children, for children in these circumstances, is to remove some of the obstacles to their success. What is important about your being part of this program is that we are at an historically unprecedented moment where we know much more than we've ever known before about the strategies that work both to promote healthy development, but also the strategies that work to help to remove obstacles to success. And what I'd like to do in the time remaining is to provide you with an example of this. One example with respect to strategies we've learned that can help to promote healthy development. And then another example with respect to strategies we've learned with respect to removing obstacles to success. And what I hope to show you is that part of what makes this an historically unprecedented moment is the fact that we now know much more, not just about the nature and course of early development, but about the tangible things we can do based on evidence-based research that will really make a difference. And this makes it a particularly exciting time then for thinking about how do we translate that into effective policies and practices. Practices that will involve coordinating both efforts we can make to produce or promote family and caregiver enablement that are coordinated with community resources that are available to families, and that also draw upon local and state systems and policy consistent with Bronfenbrenner's model. So let's begin with considering examples of ways in which we can promote healthy development. And there are really lots of those now that have a good deal of evidence behind them. These include, for example, tax policies such as child deduction credit and earned income tax credit that show in experimental and quasi-experimental studies demonstrated effects in terms of improving children's well-being and the well-being of their families. It also includes initiatives like family leave, access to affordable health care and home visitation, just to name a few. But what I'd like to do in providing an example of this research evidence is to focus on the intersection between families and systems of childcare and early education. Because if nothing else, what COVID has taught us is how much parents' employment and parents' economic well-being, indeed parents' mental health, depends on reliable access to education and to childcare for the children in their homes. Now, I want to note that I'm not using the term daycare here, because what the brain development research has shown us is that the old idea of daycare as a place to park the children to promote adult workforce participation is really obsolete now. What the brain development research has shown us, in other words, is that what we need are systems of early care and early education that are actively promoting the child's developing brain and cognitive and social emotional skills while they are in those settings that enable their adults to work. What we're looking for, in other words, are not just slots where we can park kids, but rather settings in which are developmentally facilitating for children. This is why I use the term early care and education. And the research is really compounding to show us how significant and long-term are the effects of high-quality early education programs for children. In fact, one of the most impressive of these studies is a project that was just published last month, in which researchers reported on a randomized trial evaluation concerning the effects of a public preschool program for 4-year-old children run by the Boston Public Schools. It turns out that because of high demand for this program that took place in the late 1990s and early 2000s, a lottery was needed to determine which of the 4,000 children in this study during this period were accepted into the program and therefore benefited from a year of high quality preschool, and which were not permitted into the program and therefore had to have that year without high quality preschool. The remarkable thing about this study, besides its large sample size, is that these children were followed up for 20 years. And the results of the lottery that randomized children into preschool or not have been absolutely remarkable. Over the course of this time, researchers found, for example, that there were significant differences in high school graduation rates, favoring those children who'd had preschool experience. There were also significant differences when children took the SAT in how they performed on that. I'm using the example here of the percentage of children who scored in the top quartile on SAT and math scores, again, favoring children with early childhood preschool experience. In addition, those children were more likely to enter university on time and therefore maintaining the momentum of their educational achievements compared to children without preschool experience. But it's important to notice not just the cognitive skills that distinguish the children who'd had this remarkable year at age 4 of preschool, because what a high quality early education program will do is also strengthen the social, emotional, and self-regulatory skills that children are developing during this period. So it perhaps is no surprise, but important nevertheless, that one other difference between children who had preschool experience and those who had not was in the record of high school disciplinary problems. I'm using standardized values here. So the preschool kids are actually negative compared to non-preschool kids. That is, they're showing a marked decrease or lower level of high school disciplinary problems compared to children without preschool experience. Remarkably, these effects were especially strong for boys compared to girls. And I think taken together across different developmental domains, they really illustrate that snowball effect, the ways in which from this study and many, many others we found that experience in high quality early education programs help to set in process, help to set in motion developmental achievements and capacities that build in other ways to create a positive momentum for children's school achievement and also for their social and behavioral competence. So let me turn to the other domain, that is, what evidence do we have that we have strategies that can help remove obstacles to success? And to illustrate this, I want to consider the experience of young children in families under economic stress, because one of the very sad stories of young children in this country, and it has been true for some time, is the very high rate of children who are living in families in poverty. This figure is drawn from statistics from US Census Bureau, retrieved at the end of 2020. And although the poverty rate for children as well as for others have decreased over the last 5 years or so, we still find a surprising proportion of children, almost 16%, who are living in families less than 100, that are making less than 100% of the federal poverty level, another 20% who are living in families that we would consider poor at 100 to 200% of the federal poverty level. Indeed, what the research shows is that the younger the child, the more likely the child is to be living in poverty. But the remarkable thing that I want to underscore by this is not just the incidence of poverty for young children, but also the way that poverty is a powerful predictor of children's negative long-term developmental outcomes. If I were to be asked, what is the single most important predictor of children's future, I would have to say it would be poverty. Because we know that children, for example, who spend at least 1 year in poverty are 10 times more likely to be poor by age 35 compared to families children living in families who are never poor. We also know that the effects of poverty extend intergenerationally. And what we know is that these effects of poverty are so important because they affect children's development on multiple levels. Research has documented the impact that poverty has on children's cognitive and social functioning, including their incidence of behavioral and emotional problems and heightened depression. Poverty impacts children's competence and self-concept, including their lower aspirations for success and lower self-esteem. And we also know that poverty impacts children's health and biology. That is, the under the skin influences that include impacts on brain development, diminished immune functioning, and altered stress neurobiology. And these developmental domains influence each other over time, and in such a way as to create, again, that snowball effect, that negative developmental cascade that helps to increase the odds that children who are living in poverty, in families in poverty in the early years, are going to be continuing some of those developmental challenges and disadvantages as they move into the school years, as they move into the high school years, as they move into early adulthood. And yet, and this is the good news story here, these childhood effects of poverty are malleable. There are a number of evidence-based interventions that have been shown to address both parental and child needs through community interventions. These include means-tested income supplements, such as earned income tax credit and SNAP or food stamps that really create demonstrated improvements in children's immediate and long-term well-being, beginning prenatally, amazingly enough. Families that get food stamps prenatally have children who years later are showing greater health. This includes also poverty's targeting, programs targeting children's health, including Medicaid, the WIC program, free and reduced lunch programs that not only improve children's health, but also strengthen their cognitive development. And these impacts, if we inaugurate them during the early years, seem to be especially important. All this is described in a very important National Academy of Sciences volume entitled A Roadmap to Reducing Childhood Poverty that was published in 2019 that really offers a national plan for how we might think about reducing the poverty rate for children to a significant degree. So what do children need from you? This is my last slide. Well, really several things, many of which you'll learn and achieve through this fellows program. First of all, we need attention to the science of early childhood development, the translation of that science into programs and policies suited to the situations in which young children are living. The science has many more translational implications than it's ever had before, and this is important. We also need recognition of the multiple levels of influence on children from families, from communities, from local and state policies, but also the multiple levels of impact, cognitive, social, self-regulatory, and biological processes in the brain and body and their interaction. We need respect, therefore, for the importance of early experiences and the significance of starting early and starting well for children's healthy development. I hope that you'll enlist natural partners to children's interests, such as parents and other caregivers, business leaders, agency staff, other elected officials, to create consortiums of concern. And finally, I hope you will, in all of these efforts, mobilize a devotion to patient capital to create sustainable change for children. The term patient capital was one that I learned from oil company executives who were describing the investments they make in new oil wells. And they recognize that the kind of drilling that the exploratory drilling they do is not likely to yield much impact, is not likely to create a productive well within the year after they have drilled. Indeed, they argue sometimes waiting for 5 or 7 years is not long enough. But what is required is patient capital to realize that the yield of your early investment is going to take some time to show. And I think that's also true for early childhood development and its long-term benefits. But as the 20-year study of the Boston preschool program shows us, those effects will be shown and they will be ones that we will be proud of. So my best to you in your work at the Fellows Program. I am grateful to be able to talk to you now, and I wish you the best.